Hello, welcome to our third lesson in our series on religion and life. Theme B, this lesson is all about the origins of human life. Your objectives today are to understand the theory of evolution and the evidence behind it. We're going to be thinking about the account in Genesis 2 of the creation of humans, and we're going to evaluate whether these two views are conflicting or compatible. What's your need to know? Your need to know is this, that Christians interpret the Bible in different ways. Some have no problem accepting the idea of evolution. However, for others, it is incompatible with the biblical accounts of creation. Let's jump on in. If we rewind back to our first lesson in this series, you'll remember we talked about scientific truth and religious truth, and how often on our quest for truth, we have to hold ideas from both disciplines together and see whether they conflict or whether they're compatible. Now, looking today at the origins of life is a really big topic with that regard. We're going to look at what science says, we're going to look at what the Bible says and see how they interconnect if they can. So let's start by looking at the idea of evolution. So evolution is simply the idea that living things change over time. That's what it means simply. Now there's lots of different theories of evolution. We're going to look at the most prominent theory today, which is evolution by means of natural selection. It all starts with this man right here, Charles Darwin. Now, hopefully you are aware of the work of Charles Darwin to some degree at the moment, but in 1859 he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. And through he was a natural scientist, and he did expeditions all over the world, and he came to see that there's lots of change and diversity in all the creatures across the world. And he came to form this concept that this had come about by what he called means of natural selection. Now there's lots to think about to do with this, and I'm just going to give you a very basic overview and understanding. If you Google what is evolution, you'll get a much better explanation of this, but I'm just going to take you through a few basic ideas today. But what you need to know in essence is that in his theory, it suggests that all living things are created in this huge family tree that goes back billions of years to the very start of life on planet Earth. Charles Darwin's theory suggests that all living things, so a bear, a rhino, a human, a chihuahua, at some point, if you look right back in their ancestral history, you would find a common ancestor. And if you kept on going back, you'd eventually end up at one singular point. And that singular point would be known as a single-celled organism. So a living thing that was very, very, very simple in design. Now you've got to imagine that for this theory to work, there's millions of years involved in this process. But ultimately, if you traced all living things back, you would get to that point and find that all things started there and over a long period of time ended up where we are today. A few key ideas you want to think about when we're thinking about evolution. Think about species. So a species is a group of living things who have similar characteristics, and they can breed. And they can breed and create more of the same, effectively. That's what a species is. Inside of a species, there's variation. So there'll be slight differences between creature to creature inside of that species. And adaptation, which is how living things are specialized to suit the environment that you find them in. So very simple explanation for this. If you imagine you've got two bears who live in a place where it's helpful to be green and big, where I'm going with this. Imagine they have these bears have a bunch of kids, and some of their kids are green, yeah, woo. Some are blue, some are orange, some are big. Now, if you imagine it's a hostile environment that they're growing up in, and some of them survive and some of them don't. So after a period of time, the ones who survive, the ones who are better suited to their environment because of their characteristics, they're more likely to breed and create more of them. So if you fast forward in time, you would find that the ones with the characteristics that better suit that environment are more prevalent. And this is basically how Charles Darwin said that evolution works. And the process for this is something that we call survival of the fittest. And you've probably heard that before. But effectively, the ones that are best suited, the fittest ones for their environment, they survive. The rest of them don't make it. So where's the evidence for this idea? Now, a huge part of the evidence we get for this idea is from fossils. I'm sure you are aware of fossils. Here's a picture of a fossil, but it's effectively where there's like a stamp, a time stamp and a snapshot of a creature at a certain point in time. And what we can do with that is we can date it and see how old it is. Let me explain this a little bit better. Here's a picture here that shows the different layers of rock in the world and what fossils have been found where. So if you imagine we dug right down deep into the ground in a certain certain part of the world, and then we turned it on its side, we'd be able to read the fossil record like a book. It would be in chronological order. So we would see that there were creatures, and we can see this, that seemed to exist a long, long time ago that then just suddenly stop. So imagine you're reading a book and those species come to an end, they've stopped, and then new species start to appear, and you can see links between species that used to exist and exist today. Effectively, you would end up with this story of that big family tree that we looked at that goes right back to single-celled organisms. I stole this from a YouTube video I'd seen. It was a very good one. This is an ape's hand. If you can see that, you can see how an ape's hand is very similar to a human hand, and you could see how maybe there was a common ancestor there. Actually, I just tricked you, and maybe you've seen this before and you were tricked yourself the first time you saw it. That's not actually an ape's hand. That is a whale's flipper, if you will. And looking at things like this, you can kind of see how this concept would work. That if we look at very different animal species like us, like whales, like apes, and we can see these similarities in type, and we trace it back through those fossil evidence that we've got, and looking at other different types of species, you could see how common ancestry would make sense. So let's pause here so you can check your understanding. Have a go at these questions and then unpause it when you're ready to hear some answers. Okay, let's check your understanding. So explain the concept of evolution using these words. So you might have said something like, there are different types of species in the world, and each species has different characteristics that make them better suited to their environment. Natural selection is the concept that the ones who are the strongest survive and go on to evolve, whereas the weaker ones who don't have the best characteristics to suit their environment die out. This has led to variation with different species existing around the world in different environments that they seem suited to. How does fossil evidence support the theory of evolution? Kind of in two ways. Through fossil evidence, we can see that some species have died out, whereas some have evolved over time and changed to suit the environments that we find them in. Why do you think that some people think there's a conflict between evolution and Christianity? So for some people, there's a few things we're going to look at actually, but for some people it's all about the time involved. And for some Christians, the timeline doesn't match up with the age of the earth that is suggested by evolution and the age of the earth that's suggested in the Bible. And your extension there was to read Genesis 2. We're going to look at that briefly now, but it'd be great if you read it for yourself as well. Okay, so Genesis 2. So we've referred already to Genesis 1 in the Bible, the creation of the world. Now Genesis 2, we get this more detailed story of God creating the first humans. And I'm going to just talk you through a very brief version of it now. So effectively, it all starts with dust or dirt or soil. And God reaches into the soil and forms out of it a human. He then breathes. The Hebrew here is wonderful. It's nishmat chaim. He breathes life into this human. It's a wonderful imagery actually, and if you look at the Hebrew and study that, it's a really great account. But effectively, what God does is He blows into or breathes breath into Adam's mouth, and the word there for Adam is a bit like gasp. So it's almost like God's formed this human out of the dust and gone, and Adam's been like. Like that, and like kind of come to life, and that's the story we get there. Now it goes on, and after Adam's met the animals and named them, great quote in Genesis 2, it says it's not good for man to be alone. And so it says that God puts Adam to a deep sleep, and from his it's an interesting choice of word, but it's either rib or side. I'm going to go with side. Forms a woman out of him. So we then have Adam and Eve. Adam the first man, Eve the first woman. Interested in this idea. When I was younger, I heard this story about being a rib, like God had taken a rib out of Adam and fashioned it into a human. But from studying Hebrew a bit later on, it seems more apparent to me that a better translation of this word is side, because you can imagine that way more clearly, a woman being formed out of the side of Adam rather than of this kind of obscure rib story. But that's my interpretation of it personally. Right, now I'm going to pause here and just get you thinking about the Bible for a minute. So we've heard about evolution and we've heard about Genesis 2. Now, you know I love a spectrum, so here's a spectrum for you. Imagine there's a spectrum of reading the Bible, where at one end of the spectrum you get a Christian who says everything in the Bible is 100% correct and true, and nothing is symbolic, it's all a historic account. And right at the other end of that spectrum, you've got someone who says the Bible, no, the Bible's all symbolism, all right? Now, things didn't really happen as described in the Bible. It's just a bunch of stories, and we're meant to read the stories, get the morals out, all right? Now, imagine that's two different ends of the spectrum. And these are two different Christians who read and understand the Bible. Now, firstly, I want to tell you this is unrealistic from my experience. You don't really get anyone right that far down the spectrum, and you don't really get anyone that far down the spectrum either. Now, the exam board would probably work with this, I think, and they would want you to call these people fundamentalists and liberal Christians. So fundamentalist Christians and liberal Christians. I'm not 100% happy with that terminology, but for the sake of your exam, if you want to make it nice and simple, these are good definitions to use. Now, the truth of the matter is that actually most Christians would find themselves somewhere not at these two extreme ends, and there's lots of reasons for that. But if we start, let's start with this guy over here with his tie on. There's poems in the Bible, all right? There's poetry in the Bible. So if there's poetry in the Bible, we know that the Bible isn't 100% correct and true in that regard. It's not a historic account because there's poetry in it. So then you have to read the Bible and accept that some of it is poetry and therefore symbolic. So you can't go with 100% reading anyway. That's kind of impossible. Now at the other end, the liberal, this extreme liberal view that you can just read it and it's a bunch of stories and take a meaning away. For me, I don't think you can, because you're then adding your own meaning. You're basically taking a document and you bring in what you want it to say to it. So these are two very extreme views. I think if you went and asked a bunch of Christians what their views were on the Bible, you wouldn't find people like this, but you would find people along this spectrum. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because when we get to evolution and Genesis 2, this is quite an important thing to grasp. That many Christians are absolutely fine with evolution and Genesis 2. Many Christians read the story of Adam and Eve that we've just looked at and read the story of the creation of the world, and they don't take it to be necessarily a historic account at the time that it suggests it occurs. They're confident that God made the world, they're confident that God made humankind and he did it personally. But in terms of their personal interpretation of it, they can take both ideas, and for them they don't conflict, they are compatible. Charles Darwin himself got some great quotes that he wrote in his lifetime. At the end of his book that we've talked about already, The Origins of Species, he says, "I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious views of anyone." And ultimately what he's saying here is, for him, his faith seems intact from what he's seen and what he understands. And for him, evolution and creation, that God was in charge of it all, worked hand in hand. About 20 years later, he said this, that among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceeded in sublimity the tropical forests. Temples filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. And I really like that quote, especially when you think about that story we just looked at, with God breathing life into Adam. I think Charles Darwin here is potentially saying, you know, from nature, what he sees when he sees and studies nature, and he's a natural scientist who came up with this concept of evolution by natural selection, he thinks of God. It moves him to think about God's creation and God's production. So don't let anyone ever tell you you can't believe in evolution and Christianity, because that is not the case. And we can see that from Charles Darwin himself. 4 areas that make evolution a little bit uncomfortable for some Christians, and that could be used to say that they're incompatible. Number 1, the speed. Evolution is a really, really, really slow process. All right, and if God is all powerful, he could snap his fingers and bring humans to Earth. So why would he have used a multi-million year process? It's chaotic. I've got a picture of an overgrown garden. It seems a bit messy, a bit chaotic, you know, like it seems like it's just, it's all gone a bit crazy. If you look at like the family tree, like, things are dying out, things are moving on. It's like, where's the order here? It feels a bit too chaotic to have someone in control of it. It's violent. We look at this crocodile about to munch this piranha. The idea of evolution is quite violent. You know, things are killing each other off. They're dying out. Would a loving God want his creation to go through that violence and pain to bring about to bring the human race to being? But it's a tough one. There's a man here with some binoculars looking for it. Where is it in the Bible? Why is evolution not in the Bible? If this is how it's done, why would it not be in the Bible? So, 4 thoughts on the back of these. Number 1 is slow. Now, when people become a Christian, the Bible says that it's a process, right? So they're going to turn to Jesus, and they don't become perfect automatically, but one day they're going to be in heaven with him where there's no sin. So the Christian path is one. The Christians would say that they turn to Jesus, and then there's a long process that ends up with them being ready for heaven in one way or another. It's a slow process, all right? God doesn't do things quickly. If you look at the story of Moses going to free the slaves, you know, God could just snap his fingers and the slaves would have been free, but he doesn't. He sends Moses there. It takes time. He has to go through all the plagues. He has upsets. Things go wrong. God doesn't do things quickly very often. We can see that in the Bible. So actually, evolution goes hand in hand with that. Let's look at the violent idea. You know, there's a lot of violence sometimes in God's work to bring things to the end goal that he wants. Let's think again about the plagues, the death of the firstborn. It's not out of God's character to use means that cause pain to bring the right end goal. Ultimately, you know, when Jesus comes down, the Son of God, to die on a cross for the sins of people, that's violence, that's pain. So actually, slow and painful doesn't take God out of the image, I don't think. Especially if you read what happens throughout the Bible, it seems that slow and painful processes how things come to be. Chaos, all right? Now, let's think about the story of Joseph in the Bible, in Genesis, towards the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph sold into slavery. You know, he gets wrongly accused of a crime. He gets forgotten about in prison. And you can imagine for him that felt like chaos and mess in his life. But as he gets to the end of his life, he can look back and say, all of these things God used for good. So again, with this idea that the evolution is chaotic, actually that's in God's character, to move about what looks like chaos and then bring it into order and use it for good. And then finally, it's not mentioned in the Bible. But what's interesting is the order of created things in the Bible match the order of evolution, with life beginning in the sea and ending up with humans evolving last. Also, if Moses wrote the book of Genesis, if God sat Moses down and said, right, I need you to write about evolution and natural selection, and I want you to mention single-celled organisms, Moses would have been like, what? So many Christians would say it's just recorded in the Bible in a kind of poetic, symbolic way that gets the message across in a way that's understandable. Final point on this topic is looking at, again, Biologos. Great website, check it out, loads of great resources on there. They talk about something called evolutionary creation, which is the idea that they believe that God created and he used evolution to do that. So you got it right there. They say God is the creator and evolution is the compelling science. This is a classic use of scientific and religious truth. For them, their religious truth has led to them the view that God created the world, and their scientific research has led to them to the belief that evolution seems the most likely way he did that. So they take those two truths, and for them, they are completely compatible. Last questions of the day. So if you're going to pause here, have a go at these, then unpause it, and we'll look at some answers. Okay, let's check your understanding. So, quick account of Adam and Eve. Adam is formed from the dirt of the ground by God, the dust of the ground. God breathes life into Adam, and he then makes Eve out of his side or out of a rib, depending on how you interpret the Hebrew word there. What are three of the four? So you might have talked about the speed of evolution. It's a slow process, it's a violent process, it's a chaotic process, and it's not mentioned in the Bible. How do Christians explain these? That God sometimes acts slowly, he sometimes acts violently, he uses chaos to bring about order, and it's just because it's not mentioned explicitly in the Bible doesn't make it untrue. The Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible, but Christians still believe in that. Evolution is incompatible with Christianity. Now, I'm not going to go into that because hopefully just from this lesson you could see why many people would not agree with that. And then your extent was to watch that great video series on evolution at biologos.org. Longest video I've made. I hope that was helpful to you guys. So just to revisit that, you need to know that Christians interpret the Bible in different ways, and some have no problem with the idea of evolution, whereas others see it as incompatible with the biblical accounts of creation. Thank you for your time today.